conclusion, right? And then again, all these things, it feeds back right to the third bullet point, right? So we have all this difficulty of interpreting results, right? And then the fourth bullet point, and then research bias, right? It could just very, very easily, right, affect the interpretation of such sensitive issues, right? I hope everybody is clear with all of this, right? So this five problems, very, very prominent, right? Okay, now let's look at all these so-called dimensions of culture. Okay, yeah, very interesting stuff. Okay, if you look at your deck of slides, I think the one that gave me the strongest impression, I have to say, right, is the first one. Okay, this monochronic versus this polychronic view, right? So the monochronic. Okay, let me just take a sip of water. Sorry, everyone. So this monochronic view, right, it applies to most of us, right, in the developed countries, right? But most prominently, I would say, as as according to our textbook, right, applies to Europe, Australia, okay, North America, right, Canada and America, right. So the people over there, right, they think that time is kind of unidimensional, right? Okay, yeah, time is they stick to a very scientific notion of time, right? So if there's something to be done on a particular day, right, it has to be done, right? So meetings are to be conducted at a specific time, right? We got to be punctual, right? Yeah, so that's the European, North American, Australian culture, right? Singapore, I think, is somewhere in between. Okay, okay. So, but before I talk about it, let's talk about polychronic, right? So, polychronic. Okay, so this belongs to cultures. Okay, they are less serious. Okay, they're more relaxed. Okay, so for them is that even though it's said on paper that you got to be punctual, it's all right to be late by a few minutes. All right, and it's perfectly all right for things not to start on time. Okay, for buses to be late, right? So that applies to the Middle East, right? According to our textbook, I'm not so sure whether that is true, but it does really apply to Caribbean, Central America, and South America, right? Yeah, yeah. So that one I can support that from my personal experiences, right? Okay, now let's look at this emotion, right? So emotion cultural display rules. Okay, this is easily understood, right? Yeah, we all know that certain cultures are just much more expressive, right? Or much more permissive, right? In the expression of emotions, right? Compared to us, right? So like in Eastern culture, yeah, usually it's like, parents always teach us, so do not show your emotions too much, right? Too much in public, yeah. Even if it's in the presence of friends and loved one, you should still be constrained, right? Yeah. Do not do something that is too freely wheelie, right? In other words, yeah. Okay, now the third thing is interpersonal space. Okay, this is very interesting stuff, right? This is social psychology stuff. So we have three kinds of spaces, right? If you guys can still recall, right? So we have this intimate space, right? The intimate physical space we share with our family, right? Friends, loved ones. And then there's this working space, right? Or the social consultative space, right? We share with our colleagues, right? Yes. And then the last thing would be the public space, right? So public space is just really for people we do not know, right? Strangers, yeah. So usually we'll keep the most distance, right? The largest space for public space, right? And then followed by social space, and then followed by our this intimate space, yeah. So if you happen to live in Singapore, all right, okay, or in any other, or you kind of grow up in any other Asian city, that is very, very crowded, okay, our this perception, okay, of this need, right, for this larger intimate space or this larger social space, right? This need, okay, this basic need for it will not be really as high, as compared to people from Europe, people from North America. Yeah. So and vice versa. So it's like, if so for some Asian people, once they go to the US, okay, or any other European country, yeah, they may not really get comfortable with the usual kind of social distance that people put between each other, right? And sometimes, if a person is kind of standing like a meter away from him, right? If that person is kind of used to colleagues like standing very, very near to him, he may actually see that thing as rude, right? As impolite, okay? But usually that's not, okay? That's just the cultural norm, okay? I mean, and like when I was in the States, people usually keep like 1 meter apart from each other, right? It doesn't really matter how close they are. Usually people just keep the distance from each other, right? Because I mean, that's the way things are, right? And also the country is big enough, there's enough space, right? Everybody likes enough space for themselves. Yeah. All right. Okay, now this the fourth bullet point is this thing we call context, right? So do you belong to this low context or high context culture, right? Yeah. So this context, it does not actually mean this physical environment. Okay, it means like the situation of the verbal communication. All right, yeah. So this is like if you from a kind of low context. Okay, this really applies to America. Okay, low context. Okay, Europe. Okay, usually people just say and mean what they said. Right. So the context has very, very little influence. Right. Yeah. It doesn't really matter. What is happening. They don't want to any kind of tricks. Okay. So people just say what they mean. Right. If I like you, they will just say, yeah, you're a great person. Right. Yeah, you're a great person. You did a marvelous job, right? They wouldn't use nonverbal cues to, put some additional pressure on you, right? However, I mean, if you kind of went to Japan or you work there, right? People there are not so they don't really mean what they said, right? Yeah. So there's will be like a kind of high context. So a lot of things you got to look at the facial expressions, right? You got to look at the body behavior, a lot of other things, lah, right? So yeah, so it's the people do not really mean what they say, right? So you got to be a little bit careful, right? Sometimes they may be smiling, but actually they're very upset with you, right? Yeah. So that's also from my personal experience. Okay, I've also encountered it, right? So personally for me, I think the low context culture is so much easier for me, right? I think for Singapore, right? For Singapore, I think we're somewhere in between. It's very hard to categorize Singapore as low context or high context. I would say Singapore is somewhere in between, right? Okay, now let's look at this tight versus loose culture. Yeah, I mean, this terminology sounds very, very loose, but it is what it is. Okay, so we have this tight culture. So if you have a tight culture, that means your culture is not very readily accepting of foreigners, right? However, if you have a loose culture, the reverse is true, right? You tend to accommodate all these differences of cultural norms, and then your country can just allow foreigners to behave the way they want, right? Again, I mean, on this continent, I think Singapore is somewhere in the middle as well, right? Perhaps more on the loose end, I would say. Perhaps more on the loose end. It really depends on which part of Singapore you're looking at. All right. So if it's the southern side, all right, Marine Parade side, where you have a lot of travelers, foreigners, I think that is really like the loose cultural side of Singapore, right? Yeah. All right. Now the last thing would be this individualism, collectivism, continuum, right? So the keyword here is like the continuum. It's not a binary construct. Okay. So I'm sure this thing is possibly the most famous two words, right? Yeah, this very famous dichotomy, right? So individualism here, okay, just don't. I tend to associate with egocentrism, but it really is not, okay? Yeah, so in a traditional sense, philosophical sense, all right, so it's really about you believing in your own potential, right? It's much more tied to self-efficacy, all right, than to egocentrism, right? So if you think that you think that your personal rights, okay, your individual freedom is just much more important than any other things, okay, than what other people think, than what the society requires of you, you are highly individualistic, right? So in America, right, I think America is still number one, right? They're very, very high on individualism, right? And then collectivism is really the reverse, right? So you kind of put your society, your country, right, your entire cultural group before you, right? So this is what happens, right, in our deck of slides, okay? This is a bit hilarious, right? I know that nobody actually in reality will write something on the right, okay? But if you do, okay, if you do, okay, on the right, okay, if you like really putting your country or your university department before your name, then you're kind of subscribing to this collectivistic notion, right? Ideology, right? Yeah. This is like, this is you're doing it out of self-volition, right? You're not being forced, okay? If you're being forced, then it's another story, right? But usually, of course, I mean, we do this, the one on the left, all right? I mean, that's like the typical format, okay? The typical format, okay? We will always put our name first and then our country last, right? Our country last, yeah. Okay, this is a very interesting example, I must say, right? Okay, now let's look at this, cross-cultural relations. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting. So this is a little bit of social psychology here as well, right? So we had this notion of culture shock, all right? Yeah, culture shock. We all know what this is, okay? Culture shock. I don't need to elaborate it further, right? So if you went to a new place, okay, yeah, usually to travel, I don't think if it's just for travel you will only encounter this honeymoon period, okay, where everything is fine, everything will be blissful. However, if you go there to work, okay, or to study, right, for many, many years, you will definitely encounter this enchantment, right? So this enchantment, so there'll be certain things that you just disenchanted, you disillusioned with, right? There's certain practices that you find it as very, very strange, totally at odds with your home culture. But that is fine, right? Because ultimately that will go away, right? Because as human beings, we're just like mice. Okay, we can be conditioned. Okay, we can be conditioned and we can adapt, right, to new circumstances. So once that happens, we have this resolution phase, right? Beginning resolution, right? There's a third phase, and then ultimately once that is over, so we're trying to deal with all these problems, all right, all this enchantment factor, and then we kind of cope, right? We'll talk to ourselves, right? We're trying to cope, right? Do some problem focused coping, emotion focused coping, and then at the end of it, right, we will be effectively functioning individuals, right? Yeah, ultimately, yeah, this is something that many people went through. I went through this as well, right? When I went overseas to study, right? And then acculturation is something that you got to consider, right? If you want to settle down in a foreign country, a foreign culture, right? So assimilation is that you just want to get yourself absorbed, right, into that new culture, right? Yeah. So this is just like the assimilation in Piaget's theory, right? Yeah. So you're kind of injecting new information, right, into your mental schema, right? So in this case, you are injecting yourself, right, into that cultural group, right? And then fusion is that you're not just doing the injection, you're trying to kind of fuse your own culture. You don't want to let go of it, right? You're just fusing your own culture with that your old culture with the new culture, right? So you want to fuse them in a way that both of them can coexist, right? And then alternation is when the fusion is not really that so successful, right? So sometimes you want to assume your old cultural identity, and while other times when at work, right, you want to assume the cultural identity of your new country. Yeah. So it's a bit ambiguous, right? It's like having a split personality, right? Not recommended. Okay, now the third point would be the stereotypes. Okay, we all know what that thing is, right? Stereotype. Okay, so it's just a prejudicial view, right? Prejudice is just a preconceived notion, right? Usually is flawed. Okay, about a person, about a cultural group, and then stereotype is definitely you want to generalize, right? That preconceived notion to the entire population, right? And that is okay, that is a bit too much, right? That's a rope too much, right? And then discrimination is actually all these prejudices or stereotypes in action, right? And then if they're kind of in action for too long, and then there's no systematic rules, there's no legislation to actually stop them, right? Like in America, before the civil rights movement, right? So that we have this thing called racism, right? Racism, yeah. So yeah, so racism is actually discrimination driven word, I would say. Okay. I mean, racism is still there, right? Definitely is always in America, but it's so much lighter these days, right? Because you now there's this systematic body of laws, to really counter racism, right? So the racism that's happening in America, or even in Singapore right now, right? I would say it's you shouldn't really call them as racism, but they're more like discrimination actually. Okay, prejudices in action, right? Okay, so it's a racism. I mean, traditional. I just want everybody to know. Traditional is that if there's no laws, governing against culture, race-related discrimination, then that is racism in the flesh. Okay, once you have all these laws, injunctions in place, all right, then that thing is really not racism. Okay, that is really just discrimination. All right. Okay, now let's look at this. The last thing, okay, that promoting cross-cultural interactions. Okay, we have to look at education. Okay, communication, language. Okay, just want to share one slide with everybody. Right, that is from two of our deck of slides. I mean, all these things are from our textbook as well. All right. But the interesting part, right, is that I want everybody to know, okay, there is this reciprocal relationship, right, between culture and language, okay, and then how that particular language, okay, and then with all its verbal and non-verbal cues, how it's being applied, right, in the particular culture, that can also kind of reinforce, right, the constitution of the culture, right? It can also reinforce the cultural norms. Yeah, so it's a two-directional loop, right? And then when you look at this Japanese, right? Some of you may know this already. Okay, there's a I, right? In Japanese is called watashi, right? And then there's boku, right? Boku and ore, right? Ore. So if boku is like for child, right? Boku for young males, okay, young boys. I like to say, I like to refer to I as boku, right? Yeah. And then ole is like older adults, right? I mean young adults, okay, young adults, college students. Then your late adolescents. Then is ole, right? Watashi is very it's gender neutral, right? Yeah, gender neutral. So, but it's very formal, and it tends to be feminine, right? The other things I wanted, I'm not so sure about that. Okay, yeah, all right. So that's just like I think watashi, boku, and ole. Yeah, usually boku and ole is just used between friends, lah, but it's just for different age groups. Yeah, so you can see, all this sensitivity. Like one word, but it can be a pronoun, right? Can be used so differently in Japanese, right? And even like in the indigenous language, right? If you look at a Maori language. Yeah, I mean the indigenous people of Africa, for instance, there's something like that as well. There's a lot of different ways to describe the person. Okay, like yeah, so you got to be very sensitive of all this cultural use of language, so that you can understand each other much better, right? Okay, so now let's see if we have